It was a cold Thanksgiving evening in Bellevue, Washington. Inside the Anderson family's sprawling mansion, more than 60 relatives laughed and chatted, wine glasses clinking under warm golden lights. And then, everything stopped. Margaret Anderson slowly rose to her feet, lifting her glass, her eyes fixed directly on me. Before dinner continues, I think it's time we made something clear. The room fell silent. Emily doesn't belong in this family. She's only here because of our money. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. A few people looked away. Daniel, my husband, said nothing. I didn't react. I didn't defend myself. I simply set my wineglass down and smiled. Because no one in that room knew that, in just 72 hours, the entire cash flow of the Anderson family would be frozen, and the only person who could make that happen was me. If you think this is just a story about humiliation, you're wrong. Comment 1 if you want to hear the full story, and maybe you'll realize something meaningful about a person's true worth. After I left that room, I didn't go back to the dinner table. I stepped out onto the balcony behind the mansion, where I could see all of Bellevue at night. The city lights shimmering, calm, completely at odds with what had just happened inside. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, a data analyst working for a fintech company in downtown Seattle. My job isn't glamorous, but it's enough for me to stand on my own 2 feet. I paid my own tuition, rented my own place, and never depended on anyone. I met Daniel 3 years ago at a small cafe near Pike Place Market. Back then, he was just a polite man, soft-spoken, never once mentioning his family. I didn't ask. Not until one day, he took me home. That mansion in Bellevue made everything clear. Daniel wasn't just doing well. He was part of the Anderson family, a name tied to major real estate projects across Washington state. And from that moment, I knew things would never be simple again. Margaret never said anything outright at first, but her eyes, the way she looked at me, the way she asked about my job, about my family, said everything. I didn't belong in their world, and they never had any intention of accepting that. The first time I formally sat across from Margaret in the living room of that mansion, she didn't ask if I was happy. She asked, "What do you do for a living?" "I'm a data analyst," I replied. She gave a faint smile and took a sip of her tea. "Oh, one of those unstable jobs, not nearly enough to keep up with this family's lifestyle." The words were light, but enough to chill the entire room. Daniel said nothing. Neither did I. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was judgment, already decided long before I ever walked in. If you've ever been underestimated like that, leave a dot in the comments. After that meeting, things didn't stop. They just became more subtle. Margaret no longer spoke to me so directly. Instead, she started pulling strings behind the scenes. Private conversations with Daniel that lasted for hours, more and more questions about finances. And then one day, Daniel said to me, his voice hesitant, "My mom wants us to sign a prenup, just to keep things clear." I looked at him, not surprised. I simply asked, "What do you think?" Daniel didn't answer right away, and that silence said everything. Not long after, I found out Margaret had hired a private firm to look into me. My credit history, my work records, even the people I had known. Everything about me, laid out like a report waiting for approval. But the strange thing was, I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't try to prove that I was worthy. I kept going to work every day in Seattle, still sitting in front of my screen, working with numbers and data like nothing had changed. But after work, I started making a few calls. Short ones, precise ones, and impossible to trace. Margaret thought she was in control. But in reality, I was the one just beginning to control the game. After the prenup was brought up, the atmosphere between Daniel and me changed. Not loudly, not with arguments, but with a distance that was impossible to ignore. He started talking to me as if he were evaluating me. As for me, I stayed the same. Going to work every morning in Seattle, returning to my small apartment, cooking, reading reports. Everything looked completely normal. But there was one difference. I stopped trying to be accepted. I no longer showed up to family dinners. I didn't react when Margaret sent those subtle suggestions about how I should change my job, my style, or even the way I spoke. Instead, I began spending more time on private calls. Short, precise, always after 10 p.m. Confirm the asset list, update access permissions, prepare contingency plans. No one asked what I was doing, and I didn't explain. Daniel thought my silence came from pressure. Margaret thought I was slowly accepting my place, but the truth was I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was finishing the final steps. Because some things, once they begin, can't be stopped halfway. My calls continued, steady, precise, not a single step out of place. And while I quietly finalized everything, on the other side, Margaret began making her move in her own way. No longer private remarks. This time, it was public. At a small gathering at a club in Bellevue, I heard my name come up, not from Margaret directly, but from her friends. That girl? I heard she's just a regular office worker. Yeah, and she married into the Anderson family, guess she knows how to pick. Comments that sounded casual, but repeated often enough to become truth in other people's eyes. The rumors spread faster than I expected. From parties, to weekend gatherings, to the looks people gave me when I walked into a room, everything felt the same. Judgment, comparison, conclusion. I didn't belong here. Daniel started to notice. He asked if I was okay. I just nodded. Not because I was okay, but because I no longer needed to explain. As for Margaret, she said nothing to me. But the way she smiled when she heard those rumors was more than enough. She thought she was winning. She thought the pressure would make me walk away. But what she didn't understand was, when a person has nothing left to lose in other people's eyes, they also have no reason to keep playing by their rules. And then, the Thanksgiving dinner Margaret had spent weeks preparing finally arrived. The Anderson mansion in Bellevue was packed. Relatives, business partners, close friends. Everything was perfectly arranged. A long dining table, warm lighting, expensive dishes, and an atmosphere that seemed inviting. But I knew this wasn't just dinner. From the moment I walked in, I could feel the way people looked at me. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was judgment, as if they had already heard enough to form their own conclusions about me. Daniel walked beside me, but the distance between us had never felt greater. Margaret, on the other hand, moved gracefully through the room, smiling, greeting guests, perfect, like the ideal hostess. But every time her eyes passed over me, there was something unmistakable behind them. Intent. When everyone had settled into their seats, when the conversations began to rise, Margaret slowly stood up. No need to tap her glass. No need to call for attention. The room fell silent on its own. I looked at her, and in that moment I understood this was exactly what she had been waiting for. A stage, and I was the main act. If you've ever been put in a situation where every eye in the room was against you, comment 3. Margaret raised her glass, her eyes still fixed on me. Before we begin dinner, I'd like to say something, just to make things clear. No one interrupted. No one stepped in. The Anderson family values standards, and we're not a place for people who come here for personal gain. She paused. Emily, you don't belong in this family. A few whispers spread across the room. Some people looked down, others stared straight at me, waiting for a reaction. I could feel Daniel's gaze beside me, hesitant, uneasy, but still silent. The air in the room turned heavy. Before, I might have tried to explain, or at least react, but now I just sat there, calm, almost strangely so. I gently set my wine glass down. No loud sound, no drama, just a small action, but enough to draw everyone's attention to me. I looked at Margaret, then spoke slowly. Thank you for saying what you really think. No anger, no sarcasm, just clarity. Then I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked away from the table, under dozens of eyes following me. No one stopped me. And the moment the door closed behind me, everything began to change. The door closed behind me, cutting me off completely from the noise inside the dining room. No more judging eyes, no more whispers, just the cold Bellevue night and the silence I had been waiting for. I didn't leave right away. I stood there for a few seconds, as if to make sure I had truly stepped off the stage Margaret had created. Then I took out my phone. The screen lit up. An unnamed contact. I tapped call. One ring, and the person on the other end picked up. Begin the process, I said, my voice calmer than I expected. A brief pause. Confirmed, they replied. No questions, no explanations. I hung up. The night breeze brushed past me, carrying a faint chill. But this time, I didn't feel pushed out anymore. Because the truth was, I had never been excluded from the game. I had only been waiting for the right moment to change the rules. Inside that mansion, dinner was still going on as if nothing had happened. Margaret was probably thinking she had just resolved a problem. But what she didn't know was, just a few minutes ago, everything she thought she controlled had already begun slipping out of her hands. The next morning, everything looked completely normal. I woke up in my small apartment in Seattle, made coffee like I always did, opened my laptop, and started working through familiar data sheets. No messages from Daniel, no calls from the Anderson family, as if last night had never happened. But close to noon, my phone vibrated, not from them, from an internal system. Verification request for the Anderson Trust Fund has been activated. I skimmed it, not reacting. A few minutes later, another notification appeared. Several large transactions are temporarily on hold for legal review. In Bellevue, things were no longer normal. Daniel was the first to notice. He called me, his voice slightly tense. "Do you know what's going on? My mom says the bank is holding some of our investments." I paused for a second. "Probably just a routine check," I replied calmly. He didn't ask anything else. But I knew this was only the beginning. Within 24 hours, a few smaller cash flows were paused. A few accounts needed to be re-verified, not big enough to cause panic, but enough to make people who were used to controlling everything start to lose their composure. Margaret might still think it was a technical issue, but the truth was, a chain reaction had already been set in motion, and once it starts, there's no stopping it halfway. By the second day, it was no longer a routine check. The alerts started coming in faster, not just through the system, but within the Anderson family itself. 2 major real estate projects on the outskirts of Seattle were suddenly put on hold. A partner bank requested a full review of the fund structures tied to the Anderson Trust. Things that had always run smoothly began to slow down, then stop entirely. Daniel called me for the second time that day. This time, his voice no longer carried the same calm. "Emily, this isn't normal. My mom's been trying to reach the bank, but they're saying they're waiting for confirmation from the primary account manager." I sat in front of my screen, watching lines of data scroll by. "Then we wait," I said. He went quiet for a few seconds. "You're sure you don't know anything about this?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have one, but because I knew any answer I gave right now would change everything. On the other side, Margaret had probably started to realize this wasn't a glitch anymore, but she still didn't know exactly what was happening. And that was the problem. Because when you don't know who's in control, every bit of power you thought you had starts to mean nothing. By the third day, everything officially slipped out of Margaret's control. It was no longer just a few transactions on hold. No longer unanswered calls. This time, it was an official email from the bank managing the Anderson Trust. The subject line was simple: "Update on Primary Control Authority." Margaret opened the email in front of Daniel and several family lawyers. No one spoke as she read. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Following the verification process, control and approval authority over transactions related to the Anderson Trust is being transferred in accordance with previously established terms. She paused. Her eyes moved quickly to the final line. "Current account manager, Emily Carter." The room fell into absolute silence. Daniel couldn't find the words. One of the lawyers frowned, flipping through documents as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And Margaret, for the first time, had no immediate reaction. Because this wasn't a rumor. Not speculation. But a fact, put in place long before. On the other side of the city, I watched a copy of that same email appear on my screen. Everything had gone exactly as planned. If you're starting to understand what's really happening, comment 2. After that email, every question in the Anderson family revolved around one thing. Why me? Margaret demanded the lawyers reopen the entire Anderson Trust file. Old documents, rarely ever revisited, were brought out one by one. And then, they found it. An additional clause, quietly signed years ago. The signature wasn't from a stranger. It was William Anderson, Daniel's grandfather, the man who built the entire empire. Attached to it was a single handwritten note. Power should never rest in the hands of those who believe they deserve it. The room fell silent as they read it. It turned out he had prepared in advance a mechanism to transfer control if the system ever fell into the hands of those who valued personal gain over principle. And the person he chose wasn't his son, not his grandson. It was me. Not because I was perfect, but because I had never tried to prove that I belonged to this family. On the other side of the city, I sat in front of my screen, reading the scanned document for the third time. There was no surprise, because I had known about that clause long before Margaret stood up at that dinner. And that's exactly why I hadn't said a single word. After the truth came out, nothing in the Anderson family was the same. The calls started shifting. It was no longer Margaret calling the bank, it was the bank waiting for confirmation from me. Daniel showed up at my apartment in Seattle that evening. For the first time since the dinner, he didn't keep his distance. "Emily, we need to talk." I opened the door, but didn't invite him in right away. "When did you know about all this?" he asked, his voice no longer angry, just confused. "Before we got married," I replied. He went quiet. I looked straight at him, no hesitation, no defensiveness. "Do you think if I had told you back then, things would be different?" Daniel didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. If I had spoken up, Margaret would have never accepted me. If I stayed silent, everything would unfold exactly as it truly was. I stepped out onto the balcony, overlooking Seattle at night. "I didn't take anything from your family," I said slowly. "But I'm not going to let them keep thinking they get to define my worth." That night, I sent a single confirmation. All financial access tied to the Anderson family was suspended indefinitely, not out of revenge, but so they would understand there are things that, once you lose control, aren't easily taken back. After the decision I made that night, everything in the Anderson family changed almost immediately. No more lavish parties, no more confident meetings with partners. The tone of every phone call shifted, careful, restrained, and edged with concern. Margaret was the most visibly affected. She stopped appearing at the events she once dominated. The people who used to surround her began keeping their distance. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. When the cash flow is disrupted, everything else follows. Daniel came back a second time. This time, he didn't ask what was happening. He just stood there, looking at me like he was trying to understand someone he thought he already knew. "How long are you going to keep this up?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. "It depends," I said after a moment. "Until things are seen for what they really are." This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. On the other side, Margaret finally fell silent. No more judgments. No more attempts to control the situation. Because for the first time, she was no longer in a position to decide everything. And sometimes, losing control is the fastest way for someone to understand another person's true value. After everything, I never returned to the mansion in Bellevue again. There was no real family talk. No perfect apology, just a quiet shift that no one could deny. Margaret no longer spoke about me the way she used to, not because she wanted to, but because she understood that what she once believed was power only exists when others allow it to. Daniel and I didn't end things with an argument. We simply stopped. Because sometimes the silence between two people says more than any explanation ever could. As for me, I went back to my life in Seattle. Same job, same numbers, same data. But this time, I no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. Because I came to understand something very clearly. A person's value isn't defined by how others see them. It's defined by who they choose to become, especially when they're being underestimated the most. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. With so much content out there, the fact that you chose to spend your time listening truly means a lot to me. And if this story made you think or resonated with you in any way, consider subscribing. Not just to follow the next stories, but so we can keep exploring what real value truly means together.